A moment ago they had no clue who I was. Their eyes quickly passed over me, from my shiny black shoes to the skin they thought didn't fit in here. With one smug gesture and a cold smile, they politely asked me to leave, as if it were part of a script. I didn't argue. I didn't bother explaining who I really was. Why should I? The real surprise was yet to come. Very soon they'd realize that this hotel, the one they were so eager to keep me out of, now belonged to me. Standing at the entrance of this grand hotel, I couldn't help but see how ridiculous the whole situation was. My suit fit perfectly, my shoes shone like mirrors, and in my pocket was the key to a world I had already conquered: wealth, success, recognition. But still, a barrier had appeared in front of me. Not one made of stone or glass, but of human prejudice, a narrow mindset that couldn't see beyond the color of my skin. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, measuring, and finally labeling me. To them, I was just a black man who had mistakenly walked through the wrong door. In their world, I didn't belong. I was an outsider, the one thing that didn't fit into their perfect picture of luxury. This place was supposed to represent prestige, comfort, and hospitality, but the air was filled with tension. The staff had already started to look at me like I was a potential problem. In moments like that, when you feel like a stranger in someone else's world, it's no longer about how much money you have. It's about how long you can stand the judgment before something changes. I wasn't angry. What surprised me more was how quickly people judge you based on your appearance, without even stopping to think about who you really are. It didn't bother me. The money I had earned could open any door, but I knew that money couldn't buy what prejudice had already ruined. I didn't need to prove my worth to them. My story was just beginning. As I walked inside, each step on the marble floor felt like a challenge. The spacious lobby, with its golden chandeliers, luxurious furniture, and perfect design, was meant to inspire admiration. But all I felt was a chill, not from the air conditioning, but from the people who filled this place. Here, luxury was mixed with arrogance. My goal was simple: check in like any other guest, but as I made my way to the reception desk, I noticed the hotel staff exchanging glances. I approached the desk where the manager, a blond man with a rehearsed smile, stood. Without even looking up, he already knew what he was going to say. When he finally did look at me, his gaze said more than words ever could. He scanned me, noticing how well I was dressed, but it didn't seem to matter to him. "I'm sorry, but there are no available rooms for you," he said. His voice polite but hollow. "Hello, friends. Let us know your name and where you're watching from in the comments. We truly appreciate your support. You inspire us and help spread awareness about important issues. Together, we can make a real difference in creating a better world." Enjoy the video. What surprised me wasn't the rejection itself, but the certainty in his voice. He spoke as if the decision wasn't his to make, as if a larger system, one that had taught him to judge by appearance, was speaking through him. In this world, luxury and arrogance were inseparable, and his words felt like the end of a play that, for me, had only just started. I could have told him my name, and everything would have changed. They would have scrambled to apologize, offered me the best suite, and showered me with compliments. But I decided to let them continue their little performance. I wanted to see just how far they would take it. A security guard, a big man with a shaved head, approached me as I stood at the desk. His face was emotionless, but his politeness was tinged with a hint of force. He walked up to me with a firmness that made it clear there was nothing to discuss. "Please, leave the hotel," he said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. I looked at him without saying a word. In that moment, I had no desire to argue or prove myself. Their ignorance and arrogance became a lesson I would remember, but it wasn't something worth explaining. I turned and walked toward the exit. Every step I took on the marble floor echoed with the promise of what was to come. I knew they had no idea how close they were to seeing their world turned upside down. They only saw in me what they wanted to see, but their world was about to change. After a few steps, I stopped and glanced back. Soon, this hotel would be mine, and then they'd understand how easily illusions can be shattered. A few weeks had passed since that day I walked out, avoiding a pointless conflict. Back then, I walked away without saying a word, but not without a plan. During that time, a clear strategy formed in my mind, to reclaim not just my dignity, but control over their world. The irony of life was that I had always been one step ahead of those who judged people by how they looked. Now, I stood in the same city, in front of the same building, but with a different status. I wasn't just another guest anymore. I was the new owner. As I made my way to the lawyers to sign the purchase documents, I felt a mix of emotions. Not anger. I had long learned not to waste energy on that. But anticipation. This was the moment when insults turned into strength and humiliation became an opportunity for power. I wasn't looking for revenge through petty tricks or childish games. No, my goal was more complex, to make them tear down their own illusions. Their pride would lead to their downfall. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but smirk as I looked at the papers confirming my ownership of the hotel. It was now mine, and this was only the first step. After signing the documents, I went to the hotel with a new mission: to observe. The staff continued their work, unaware that their world was about to change. To them, I remained invisible. My name hadn't yet been mentioned in the boardroom, which gave me the freedom to watch them as they really were. The meeting with the hotel's general manager went as expected, formal. He was a confident, somewhat arrogant man who probably believed he had everything under control. "Our staff is stable and professional," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "We haven't had to let anyone go in a long time, and our turnover rate is minimal." I nodded, keeping my calm expression, but inside, my certainty grew. Their world was on the edge of falling apart, and they had no idea. I studied them all. The same blonde manager who had denied me a room, the security guard who had escorted me out. They all went about their lives, unaware of the collapse heading their way. As I walked down the stairs after the meeting, I stopped for a moment, thinking, should I act right now, expose them all, and fire them in one swift move? Or should I let them continue living in their delusion a little longer, enjoying their false sense of security? My plan depended on one thing: patience. The day I decided to start my little show came unexpectedly. I was walking through the corridor, glancing around the lobby, when I saw him, the manager, the same blonde one. He was deep in his work, occasionally looking up from his papers to check something in the logbook. He didn't notice me. I was standing just a few feet away, but this time I wasn't invisible. I was the owner of this building, though only I knew it. His face was relaxed, unaware that his job was already in my hands. For a moment, I thought about how easy it would be to change everything right then. One word, and he would lose his position. His confidence and comfortable life would fall apart. But where was the satisfaction in that? My enjoyment came from watching them dig their own graves, from seeing how their actions would lead to their downfall. I wanted them to realize their mistake. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. Smiling silently, I turned and continued walking. There were much more important steps ahead. Today, I was walking into the same hotel, but this wasn't the same day I left feeling humiliated. Now I returned with complete power. Everything had changed. This hotel was no longer a fortress that once rejected me. Now it was my domain, and I was ready to take control, even though they didn't know they had already lost it. From early morning, I could feel a certain tension, as if the air had grown heavier. Maybe it was all in my head. But knowing that I was about to face the people who had looked down on me just weeks ago filled me with energy. I was calm, even cold, but inside my resolve was burning. The only question was, how would they react when they realized their world had shifted? Before stepping into the conference room, I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and allowed myself a brief smile. I knew I was doing this without any warning. No prior notice to prepare them. That was the whole point. I wanted them to feel the chaos, like the ground was slipping from beneath their feet. When I entered the conference room, everyone was already seated. At first, they didn't notice me. I chose a seat in the corner, where I could watch without drawing attention. The manager, the same one who had denied me a room, stood by the board, speaking with confidence. He went over the day's plans with the same arrogance he'd shown when he passed judgment on me. I sat quietly, watching. He had no idea his world had just collapsed. When our eyes met, I saw his expression change. It was quick, Just for a second, but I saw the recognition in his eyes. He froze, his words stuck in the air. First, his face went pale, then he put on a mask of professionalism. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. His voice was steady, but cold. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to watch what was happening between us. "I'm your new owner," I said calmly, with a slight smile. The silence in the room was overwhelming. My voice was calm, but the impact was huge. I watched his face go through disbelief, shock, and finally fear. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. No one said a word. It felt like even the air had stopped moving, waiting for what would happen next. The employees' eyes moved back and forth between me and the manager, as if they were waiting for a storm to hit. The manager tried to speak. His lips moved, but no words came out. His breathing grew heavier, his face paler, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. I could see the plans and confidence he'd built over the years falling apart in his mind. He couldn't believe that the man he'd once looked down on was now his boss. His career, his stability, everything had been shattered by a single sentence. This was the beginning of the end for him. Everything he had relied on, his position, his status, his power, was now working against him. He was just another employee now, and the most ironic part, he was answering to the person he had once dismissed. I stood up and walked toward the exit. The room stayed silent, everyone still in shock from what had just happened. But this was just the beginning. I was ready for this hotel to change beyond recognition. I wasn't just going to rebuild the walls, I was going to transform the whole structure. After I declared myself the owner, no one knew what was coming next. Maybe they expected immediate firings or drastic changes, but I wasn't playing a predictable game. What fascinated me was what people reveal when their world starts to fall apart. Every day, I became more aware of how much power I had. I could break their confidence and shatter their illusions at any moment. But I chose a different path. It wasn't enough to just pull off their masks. I wanted them to remove those masks themselves. I wanted to watch as their familiar worlds crumbled, and they began to understand the full weight of their prejudice. One morning, as I prepared for the day ahead, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Now, I could watch as they struggled to adapt to a new reality, revealing their true selves. To start, I changed their work schedules. I gave them tasks they once thought were beneath them. I made them work alongside lower-level employees as equals. This was my test, to see how their arrogance would break down. A few weeks passed since I had introduced the new rules. Every day felt like a chess game, with my pieces carefully positioned, waiting for the perfect move. I observed them, studied their reactions, and watched as their arrogance turned into insecurity. Those who once looked down on others now found themselves doing the very tasks they had once thought were unworthy of them. I watched as the manager, always so sure of himself, began to lose his grip. His pride slowly faded as he was forced to negotiate with junior staff or take on small tasks he once thought were beneath him. Each day, his face grew more tense. A sense of helplessness started to build inside him, though he still tried to hold on. The other employees were beginning to crack as well. Their confidence, once solid, was melting away like ice in the sun. They all seemed lost, and that's where my satisfaction lay. Conversations became shorter, and no one smiled anymore. I wasn't just the owner of the hotel now. I had become the invisible hand, pushing at their deepest fears. One day, while walking through the hotel, I crossed paths with the manager in the lobby. He looked exhausted, his gaze unsure, but he stepped forward. "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay composed. "About my role in the hotel, about the importance of what I do." I allowed myself a small smile and stopped in front of him. This was the moment I had been waiting for. As he spoke about his important role, I knew the time had come. He was still holding on to the illusion of his importance, but his confidence was fading. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. His words sounded desperate, like he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. He tried to convince me that his work was essential to the hotel's success, but each argument felt hollow. I knew what was really on his mind, how to hold on to his place beneath me. When he finally finished, I smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile, but a calm one, filled with power. "I remember you," I said, looking him in the eye. "I remember how you kicked me out of here. Do you remember that day? His face went pale. I could see the fear taking over. He understood that all his words, all his attempts to hold on to his significance, were pointless. He had nothing left to say. Silence filled the space between us. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Everything he had built, his arrogance, his false sense of importance, collapsed in front of him. His role, his mask, it all disappeared. He realized that he was no longer in control. I was now the one deciding his fate. But this was only the first step. Every day in this hotel felt like a chess game, where I could predict my opponent's moves and dismantle their strategy. I knew they only saw me as the owner, someone in the background, but their true selves, their lies and deceit, were starting to show. From the moment I first stepped into this hotel as its owner, I knew that patience would help me reveal everything. I started assigning them small tasks that seemed ordinary at first. A change in the schedule, extra responsibilities, small shifts in the structure. But for me, it was all a test. I was weaving a web, each move carefully calculated. I wanted to see how far they would go to keep their positions. It's remarkable how people, so used to stability, start to lose their footing when the world around them begins to shift. In such moments, a person's true nature is revealed. Lies and arrogance always lead to collapse, and I was prepared to watch them destroy themselves. As each day passed, and I added new tasks, I noticed their reactions changing. At first, they were mildly irritated. Why should these changes affect them? But soon I saw some begin to cover up their mistakes, others hiding their flaws, and still others betraying their colleagues. I sat in my office, watching as the team's atmosphere grew more tense. For years, they had built their careers on deception and false confidence. But now, with the rules changed, they were facing a new reality where their old strategies no longer worked. One employee lied about completing a task, another sabotaged their colleagues, and another tried to shift blame. One day, I overheard a brief exchange between two employees. "I can't finish this on time, but if you help me, I'll tell management it was all your idea," one of them said, hope in his voice. The other employee, smirking, replied, "You want me to do your work? No chance. I'll just tell them you messed everything up." That brief exchange told me everything I needed to know. They were ready to throw each other under the bus just to survive. It was the moment their masks began to slip, revealing their true selves. At the end of the day, I gathered everyone in the large conference room. They didn't know why they'd been called, but they could feel the tension. I could see it in their eyes. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to hide their anxiety. When everyone was seated, I stood before them, letting the silence fill the room. It was a heavy silence, full of tension. I slowly looked at each of them. "Today, I want to talk about how your deceit isn't just destroying this hotel, it's destroying you," I began, my voice calm but firm. "For the past few weeks, I've been watching you. And do you know what I've seen? Lies. You lie to each other, to yourselves, and to me. Each of you has built your career on deception, and today I'm here to show you where that's led you." I then projected the evidence onto the screen. Emails, security footage, and documents showing how they'd tried to cover their tracks. Their faces turned pale as they realized there was no place left to hide. Their lies were no longer a secret. I paused the video and looked at them again. "Your schemes have destroyed you. You thought you could hide behind your deceit. But now that's no longer possible." The look on their faces was pure despair. They knew the game was over. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was the moment they realized their entire lives, built on lies and manipulation, had crumbled. Every move I made in this hotel was calculated, bringing me closer to my ultimate goal. Those who had once looked down on me were now tangled in their own web of deceit. But I wasn't done. The lies and prejudices ran too deep. For them, this wasn't just a temporary attitude. It was a way of life. I knew they needed more than exposure. They needed to face the consequences of their prejudice, not just on an abstract level, but in the most personal way possible. So I began restructuring the hotel, slowly at first, almost unnoticed. Some employees lost their privileges, while others were given new opportunities. The new staff I hired was predominantly black. These individuals, once sidelined by society, now had the chance to lead those who once considered themselves superior. Every day, I watched as the old staff, used to their privileges, faced a new reality. They resisted, tried to hold on to their positions, but soon realized it was useless. Their world was collapsing, and all they could do was accept it. I remember the day the old manager, the same one who had denied me a room, came face to face with this new reality. I entered the hotel lobby and saw him standing behind the reception desk, nervously shuffling papers. His face was tense, and his hands trembled slightly. The man who had once been so sure of his authority was now performing the simplest tasks, the kind of work he had once despised. I stepped closer and watched him. At that moment, a family approached the desk, a mother, father, and their 2 children. They were all black. The manager saw them and instantly turned pale. It wasn't just recognition, it was fear. He realized that now he had to serve those he had once rejected, those he had considered beneath him. "Good afternoon," he began, but his voice was weak and shaky. The father nodded politely and said, "We've booked a room for a week. We'd like to check in." The manager awkwardly nodded and started the check-in process, trying to hide his internal turmoil. His hands moved slowly over the computer keys, and his face showed complete defeat. I could see him shuddering, struggling with what was happening. The man who had once looked down on me was now forced to humble himself before those he had once scorned. I silently observed, not intervening. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I saw his prejudices breaking down, his pride being shattered by reality. When the check-in was complete and the family had walked away, I approached the manager. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, as if he wanted to disappear, to dissolve in this situation that was tearing apart everything he thought he knew about himself and his world. "How does it feel?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. I could see his shoulders slumping, his face pale, as if all the strength had drained from him. "It's just a job," he mumbled, trying to hide the despair in his voice. But I didn't let him escape the truth. "You denied me a room once. Today you served those you despised. How did that feel?" He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, filled with fear and humiliation. It wasn't just fear of his new boss, it was the realization of his own insignificance, the collapse of all his prejudices and pride. His voice faltered, unsure of what to say. He knew that everything he had done, all his beliefs, had led to this moment, and now there was no escape except to accept it. I didn't say another word. I simply nodded and walked away, giving him time to process what had just happened. This wasn't the end, but it was a pivotal moment. He had realized that the old order would never return. I knew it was all coming to an end. Every employee who had once been so sure of their superiority had faced their own trials. I watched as their worlds collapsed, as their lies and prejudices consumed them. But this wasn't just about revenge, it was about cleansing. They needed more than to just realize their mistakes. They needed to feel their old world slipping away beneath their feet. Today was an important day. I had gathered everyone in one place, the very people who had once discriminated against me, who had thought they were better because of false stereotypes. But now their status had changed. I gave them a final choice. They could leave with compensation and forget this chapter of their lives, or they could stay and continue working, but under completely different rules. I knew many of them wouldn't withstand the pressure, but that didn't concern me. Those who stayed would have to undergo a complete transformation. My emotions were mixed in that moment. It wasn't triumph or vengeance. It felt more like closure, as if I was finally closing a chapter of my life. Everything that had happened here wasn't just personal, it was a lesson, not just for them, but for myself as well. I stood in the conference room, looking at those who had once embodied discrimination and prejudice in this hotel. Their faces were grim, many already realizing that the power they once held was gone forever. They no longer controlled the situation. Now, everything depended on me. "Today, you stand before a choice," I began, watching their reactions. "You can leave with compensation and forget this hotel as a bad dream, or you can stay and continue working, but under new rules. You will have to accept the changes that have happened here and work according to the conditions I set." Some immediately lowered their eyes, nervously shuffling papers. These were the ones who knew they couldn't survive in this new order. They had already decided to leave. Others, those with nothing left to lose, looked at me with uncertainty, but also understanding. They knew their options were limited. Those of you who choose to leave will receive generous compensation, but know this: if you stay, you will have to change everything. Your attitude, your work ethic, and your worldview. One of the old managers, the same one who had once refused me service, raised his hand. His face was a mix of fear and desperation. "And what happens to us if we leave?" he asked, barely concealing the tremor in his voice. I looked him directly in the eye and replied calmly, "You'll start over, without your former privileges, but with a chance to rethink your life." His face darkened. He understood that his old life, built on lies and arrogance, was over, and now he would have to face a new reality. The last day of their work had come. Some employees had already packed up and left the hotel. They couldn't handle the changes and didn't want to accept the new order. Those who remained were beginning to adapt to a reality where their sense of superiority no longer existed. I walked into the hotel lobby and saw the manager standing near the exit. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked defeated. This was the same man who had once refused me a room without even bothering to find out who I was. Now he stood before me, fully aware that everything had changed. I approached him and stopped beside him. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You didn't even try to know who I was," I said calmly. He didn't respond. His face stayed expressionless, but his eyes were empty. This was a man who had realized his entire life had been built on false foundations. Now he had nothing left to restore the confidence he once had. He only nodded, still not raising his eyes, and walked out the door. I watched him leave, knowing this was inevitable. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. It was simply the end. The end of a story that had begun with humiliation but concluded with justice. In a world where prejudice blinds us, the truth often reveals itself when it's too late. A racist restaurant owner named Harold kicks out David and Emma Smith, a black couple, when they come to celebrate their 10th anniversary. But when Harold discovers who they really are, it's too late to rectify his mistake. What compels Harold to confront the reality of his actions? Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Harold Thompson stood near the entrance of his restaurant, surveying the evening crowd with the discerning eye he had honed over the years. La Maison Elegante was more than just an upscale dining establishment. It was a symbol of Harold's success. Nestled in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, La Maison Elegante was renowned for its exquisite French cuisine, impeccable service, and an atmosphere that whispered luxury. Harold had built the restaurant's reputation from the ground up, and now it was the go-to place for the city's elite. Attorneys, politicians, celebrities, and business moguls all passed through its doors, drawn by the promise of privacy and a dining experience unmatched by any other. To Harold, maintaining the restaurant's image was paramount. Every detail mattered, from the pristine white tablecloths to the perfectly arranged floral centerpieces on each table. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers illuminated the room in warm light, while the faint sound of classical music played in the background, enhancing the ambiance. The restaurant was designed to exude elegance, and Harold took great pride in ensuring that only a certain type of clientele walked through its doors. Harold himself was a man of distinction. In his early 60s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a sharp suit tailored to perfection, he carried himself with an air of authority. His features were chiseled, his posture impeccable, and his demeanor always calm and composed. His wealth was evident not just in his appearance, but in the way he conducted himself. He was proud of what he had achieved, and he believed that the exclusivity of his restaurant was a reflection of his success. However, beneath that polished exterior lay a man who held certain beliefs about who belonged in his establishment and who did not. Though Harold was careful never to exhibit overt racism, those who knew him well were aware of his biases. He prided himself on making subtle judgments about individuals, often based on their appearance, background, or behavior. To him, La Maison Elegante was a sanctuary for people of class, and he was determined to keep it that way. This meant that certain individuals, whom he deemed unfit for his establishment, were quietly but deliberately discouraged from returning. That evening, as Harold stood at the entrance, he noticed a couple approaching the restaurant. They were impeccably dressed, the man in a tailored black suit and the woman in a stunning red dress that flowed elegantly as she walked. Their outfits were tasteful, sophisticated, and entirely appropriate for the restaurant. But Harold's gaze narrowed as they came closer. The couple, David and Emma Smith, were black. For a moment, Harold's smile faltered. It was a subtle reaction, one that would have gone unnoticed by most, but to those who knew him, it was a telltale sign of his disapproval. David Smith was a tall, well-built man with a calm confidence in his stride. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, and his short-cropped hair was neatly groomed. Beside him, Emma walked with grace and poise. Her dark curls framed her face beautifully, and her eyes sparkled with warmth and intelligence. They were a striking pair, a picture of elegance and success. But to Harold, their race overshadowed everything else. He immediately questioned whether they belonged in his restaurant, whether they would fit the image he had so carefully cultivated over the years. As David and Emma reached the entrance, Harold forced a smile and greeted them with his usual polished courtesy. "Good evening," he said, his tone smooth and practiced. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "Yes, we do," David replied, smiling back. "It's under the name Smith." Harold nodded, but internally, he was already making judgments. He couldn't help but wonder if their reservation was a mistake or if they had somehow managed to slip through the cracks in his carefully controlled reservation system. He glanced at his maitre, who was standing a few steps behind him, and gave a barely perceptible nod. The maitre d' quickly checked the reservation list, then looked back at Harold with a subtle expression that confirmed the reservation was indeed legitimate. In the world of exclusivity, true confidence can provoke the fiercest resistance. "Ah, yes, Mr. Smith," Harold said, his voice betraying none of his inner thoughts. "Right this way, please." As he led David and Emma to their table, Harold couldn't help but notice the glances from some of the other patrons. They were the usual clientele, wealthy, predominantly white, and accustomed to a certain atmosphere. A few diners raised their eyebrows while others exchanged looks that conveyed a shared understanding. Harold knew what they were thinking because he was thinking it too. What were David and Emma doing here? The couple's presence disrupted the unspoken, carefully curated image of exclusivity that Harold had worked so hard to maintain. He guided them to a table near the back, close to the kitchen doors and away from the center of the dining room. It was a table that Harold reserved for guests he considered less desirable, those who didn't quite fit the mold of what he believed his restaurant represented. The placement was deliberate, a subtle way of sending a message. As they approached the table, Harold gestured for them to sit. "Here we are," he said, his tone as polite as ever. "I hope you enjoy your evening with us." David and Emma exchanged a quick glance but said nothing. They took their seats, with David pulling out a chair for Emma before sitting down himself. Harold lingered for a moment longer, studying them with a critical eye. He noted their composed demeanor, the way they held themselves with dignity and grace, but instead of appreciating their elegance, Harold saw only what he wanted to see. Two people who, in his mind, didn't belong in his restaurant. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice soft but firm. "We're looking forward to it." Harold nodded curtly and walked away, but his mind remained occupied with thoughts of the couple. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that their presence had stirred within him. It wasn't just that they were black. It was that they carried themselves with a confidence that challenged his preconceived notions. He was used to people being intimidated by the exclusivity of his restaurant, but David and Emma seemed entirely at ease, as if they belonged there just as much as anyone else. Back at the entrance, Harold pulled the maitre aside and whispered, "Keep an eye on them. Make sure everything is handled appropriately." The maitre d' nodded in understanding. "Of course, Mr. Thompson." Harold returned to his post, his thoughts still lingering on David and Emma. He didn't like that he felt unsettled by them, but he couldn't deny it. Something about the couple made him uneasy, and that unease only fueled his determination to assert control over the situation. As the evening progressed, Harold kept glancing in their direction, watching for any sign that would justify his discomfort. But David and Emma were nothing if not composed. They spoke quietly to each other, occasionally glancing at the menu, seemingly unaware of the scrutiny they were under. For David and Emma, this dinner was supposed to be a special occasion. It was their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone they had been looking forward to celebrating. They had chosen La Maison Elegante not only because of its reputation, but also because they believed their hard work and success deserved recognition in a place like this. They had heard about the restaurant's exclusivity and had even seen it featured in high-end magazines. To them, it represented a reward for their achievements, a place where they could relax and enjoy each other's company without the pressures of daily life. However, from the moment they stepped through the door, they sensed the tension in the air. They noticed how Harold's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and how he guided them to a table that felt oddly out of place in such a refined setting. They were no strangers to subtle racism, having encountered it in various forms before. Still, they had hoped that tonight would be different, that they could simply enjoy their evening without any of the complications that often accompanied being black in spaces dominated by white patrons. As they sat at the table, Emma reached across to take David's hand. "It's a beautiful restaurant," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. David nodded, though he could sense what Emma wasn't saying. "It is," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Let's make the most of it." In a world of unspoken rules, the courage to remain dignified can become a powerful act of defiance. David and Emma Smith both knew what was happening, but they refused to let it ruin their evening. They had learned long ago how to navigate situations like this, how to rise above the microaggressions and slights that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Tonight was supposed to be about them, celebrating their love and the life they had built together. They wouldn't allow Harold's narrow-mindedness to take that away from them. As the evening progressed, Harold's disapproval grew more palpable. He found himself glancing at David and Emma more often than he should have, as if he were waiting for them to do something that would confirm his biases. But they gave him nothing. They were the epitome of class and grace, treating the staff with respect and behaving impeccably. Their very presence seemed to challenge everything Harold believed about who should and shouldn't be in his restaurant. Despite their calm demeanor, David and Emma were acutely aware of the undercurrent of hostility directed at them. They noticed the way the waitstaff hesitated to approach their table, the way other diners occasionally glanced their way before quickly looking away. It was as if they were being watched and judged, every move they made scrutinized for some imagined fault. But instead of reacting, they remained composed, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them uncomfortable. Harold, meanwhile, continued to wrestle with his own conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he prided himself on maintaining a veneer of professionalism and politeness, never openly displaying his prejudices. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that David and Emma were somehow challenging his authority simply by being there. He resented them for disrupting the carefully cultivated image of his restaurant, for daring to act as if they belonged in a place that, in his mind, was reserved for people of a different class. His class. The evening at La Maison Elegante was in full swing. Diners chatted quietly over candlelit tables, sipping fine wines and savoring delicate dishes prepared with the utmost care. The clink of silverware on porcelain and the murmur of conversation filled the air, creating an ambiance of refined tranquility. For Harold Thompson, everything was as it should be. Everything except for the presence of David and Emma Smith. The couple had been seated for a while now, patiently waiting for their meal to arrive. David and Emma had done everything by the book. They had made a reservation well in advance, arrived on time, and conducted themselves with the utmost politeness. Yet, Harold's irritation simmered just below the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong here, that their presence disrupted the carefully crafted atmosphere of his establishment. He was determined to find a way to reassert control, to remind them that this was his restaurant. Harold's first move was subtle, but deliberate. He instructed the waitstaff to delay serving David and Emma's food. While other tables received their orders promptly, the couple's appetizers were conspicuously late. David and Emma exchanged a glance but said nothing, choosing instead to sip their water and engage in quiet conversation. They had noticed the delay, but they refused to let it spoil their evening. As the minutes ticked by, Harold's frustration grew. He had hoped that the delay would make David and Emma uncomfortable, perhaps even provoke them into complaining, but they remained calm, unbothered by the obvious slight. This composure only irritated Harold further. He felt as though they were mocking him with their poise, silently challenging the unspoken rules of his restaurant. After what felt like an eternity, a waiter finally approached their table with the appetizers. The young man looked nervous as he set the plates down, aware of the tension in the air. Harold had made it clear to his staff that David and Emma were not to be given the same level of service as the other guests, and the waiter had followed his instructions to the letter. "Sorry for the delay," the waiter mumbled, avoiding eye contact as he placed the dishes on the table. "No problem," David replied with a polite smile. "Thank you." The waiter nodded quickly and retreated, eager to escape the discomfort of the situation. As David and Emma began to eat, Harold watched them from across the room, his mind racing. They were too composed, too unflappable. He needed to do something more direct, something that would make it clear that they were not welcome here. Leaning in close to his maitre d', Harold whispered, "I want you to check their reservation again. Make sure it's legitimate." The maitre d' hesitated for a moment, sensing the underlying hostility in Harold's request, but he knew better than to question his boss. In a realm defined by privilege, confronting prejudice often takes more courage than one can muster. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," the maitre d' replied, bowing slightly before hurrying away to carry out the order. A few minutes later, he returned, confirming that the reservation was indeed valid. Harold felt a surge of anger. He had been hoping for an excuse, any excuse, to confront the couple directly, but with their reservation confirmed, he couldn't simply throw them out without risking a scene. Still, Harold was not one to give up easily. Determined to assert his authority, he decided to approach the couple himself. He straightened his suit jacket, donned his most practiced smile, and walked over to their table. David and Emma looked up as he arrived, their expressions polite but guarded. "Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith," Harold began, his tone smooth, yet tinged with condescension. "I trust you're enjoying your evening so far?" "We are, thank you," Emma replied, her voice calm and measured. "Good, good," Harold said, nodding slowly. "I wanted to personally ensure that everything was to your satisfaction. You see, we pride ourselves on providing an exceptional dining experience here at La Maison Elegante, and I'd hate for anything to be out of place." There was a subtle edge to Harold's words, a suggestion that something about David and Emma was indeed out of place. The couple understood the implication immediately, but they refused to rise to the bait. "Everything has been fine," David said, his voice steady. "We appreciate your concern." Harold's smile tightened. He could sense that they were not going to be easily intimidated, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I couldn't help but notice," he continued, his tone now more pointed, "that your reservation seemed to have caused a bit of confusion earlier. It's rare that we encounter such unusual circumstances." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Unusual circumstances?" Harold nodded, his smile unwavering. "Yes, well, we don't often receive reservations from—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Guests who are new to our establishment." David and Emma exchanged a glance. They knew exactly what Harold was implying, but they weren't about to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, David responded with the same calm politeness he had maintained all evening. "We made the reservation through the same process as anyone else," he said. "I'm sure it was no different from any other reservation you've received." Harold felt his irritation growing. They were too composed, too unshakable. He had expected them to react, to give him a reason to assert his authority more forcefully, but instead, they remained calm, refusing to rise to his provocations. Of course," Harold said, his voice tightening. "I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. You understand, of course, that we have certain standards to maintain here." "We understand," Emma replied, her voice cool. "And we appreciate your attention to detail. It's why we chose to celebrate our anniversary here." Harold's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. They had mentioned their anniversary, a detail he hadn't known before. For a brief moment he considered backing down, letting the matter rest. But his pride wouldn't allow it. He had made up his mind that David and Emma didn't belong here, and he wasn't going to let them enjoy their evening without reminding them of that fact. "Well," Harold said, straightening up slightly, "I'm glad to hear that. But I must say, I'm surprised you chose La Maison Elegante for such a special occasion. It's not the sort of place one typically finds your type of clientele." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. It was the first time Harold had directly referenced their race, and he watched their reactions closely, waiting for a crack in their composure. But David and Emma didn't flinch. Instead, David leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Our type of clientele? Sometimes the ugliest truths are revealed not through anger, but through calm, quiet dignity." "Marcus," David repeated, his voice steady. "And what type would that be, Mr. Thompson?" Harold hesitated for a split second, sensing the trap that had been set for him, but by now he was too committed to back down. He needed to regain control of the situation, no matter the cost. "We cater to a very specific demographic here," Harold said, carefully choosing his words. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of exclusivity. I'm not sure you quite understand the nature of our establishment." There it was, the thinly veiled insult Harold had been building toward all evening. He had finally said what he'd been thinking since the moment David and Emma walked through the door. To him, they didn't belong here, and he wanted them to know it. For a brief moment, silence fell over the table. David and Emma exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, without breaking eye contact with Harold, David spoke. "I see," David said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Thompson." There was something unsettling in David's tone, but Harold couldn't quite place it. He had expected anger, perhaps even outrage, but instead he was met with calm acceptance. It was as if David had anticipated this confrontation all along and was simply waiting for it to unfold. Emma leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice firm yet polite. "But I assure you, we are fully aware of the nature of your establishment. That's precisely why we chose to dine here. We were looking forward to a special evening together." A flicker of doubt crossed Harold's mind. There was something about their quiet confidence that unsettled him. But he quickly brushed aside the doubt. He was the owner, and he had the final say on who was welcome in his restaurant. "I'm afraid I must insist," Harold said, his voice growing colder. "I don't believe this is the right place for you. I think it would be best if you left." The words slipped out before Harold could stop himself. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. But there was no turning back now. He had made his stance clear, and he was determined to see it through. David and Emma sat in silence for a moment, letting Harold's words sink in. Then slowly, David stood up, followed by Emma. Her expression was calm, but resolute. They both knew they could escalate the situation further, but they also knew it wasn't worth it. This wasn't the time or place for a confrontation. They had been disrespected, even humiliated, but they refused to give Harold the satisfaction of seeing them falter. As they gathered their belongings, Harold felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it regret? Doubt? He wasn't sure. But he quickly buried the feeling, reminding himself that he had done what needed to be done. He had protected the image of his restaurant, ensuring it remained a place for the right kind of people. Just as they were about to leave, David turned to face Harold. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Harold suddenly feel very small. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson," David said, his voice steady. "We won't trouble you any further, but remember this, people will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Emma nodded in agreement, her gaze steady. "Have a good evening," she added, her voice polite but firm. With that, David and Emma turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Harold standing there, his hands clenched at his sides. The other diners, who had been watching the confrontation with varying degrees of interest, quickly returned to their meals, pretending not to have noticed what had just transpired. But the tension in the room lingered, a heavy unease that hung in the air long after David and Emma had gone. Harold returned to his post, his expression carefully composed, but inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that there would be consequences for what he had done, that this would come back to haunt him. But Harold ignored the voice, pushing it down along with the uncomfortable feelings that accompanied it. He had won, after all. He had asserted his authority and protected the integrity of his establishment. Sometimes, the consequences of our actions ripple far beyond what we can foresee, leaving us to grapple with truths we never wanted to confront. And that was all that mattered, or so he told himself. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge, Harold knew that this was far from over. He had set something in motion, something he couldn't control. Though he didn't realize it yet, the events of this evening would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. As David and Emma walked away from La Maison Elegante, they exchanged a glance. There was no need for words. They both knew what the other was thinking. They had been humiliated, but they had also seen something in Harold that he had not intended to reveal. His weakness, his fear, his insecurity. They knew that in the end, it was Harold who would pay the price for his actions. They had a plan, a way to turn this night of humiliation into something much more powerful. They had the resources, the connections, and most importantly, the resolve to see it through. For now, though, they walked away quietly, leaving the past behind them as they stepped into a future that would look very different for Harold Thompson and La Maison Elegante. The battle had just begun. It had been a few days since the incident at La Maison Elegante, and Harold Thompson had mostly pushed the unpleasant evening out of his mind. He had convinced himself that he had handled the situation well, that he had protected his restaurant from the intrusion of people who didn't fit his carefully curated image. To Harold, David and Emma Smith were a brief, unfortunate disruption. Nothing more. He expected that his life and business would continue as they always had, untroubled by the events of that night. But life has a way of turning the tables when one least expects it. It was a quiet morning at the restaurant. The dining area, normally filled with the soft hum of conversations and the clinking of fine china, was empty and still. Harold was in his office, reviewing the weekly reports, his mind focused on the usual minutiae of running his business. His restaurant was a well-oiled machine, and he took pride in overseeing every detail, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. As he sifted through the papers on his desk, Harold's assistant knocked on the door and entered, holding a sleek envelope. The assistant, a young man named Charles, was typically unflappable, but today there was an unusual note of curiosity in his voice. "Mr. Thompson," Charles said, handing the envelope to Harold, "this came for you this morning. It's marked urgent." Harold took the envelope, frowning slightly as he examined it. The paper was heavy, embossed with a subtle pattern that suggested wealth and sophistication. The return address was from a prestigious law firm, one that Harold recognized as being associated with high-profile clients and significant financial dealings. "Thank you, Charles," Harold said, dismissing the assistant with a wave of his hand. Once he was alone, he carefully opened the envelope, intrigued by its contents. Inside was a letter, printed on fine stationery, with the law firm's letterhead at the top. The text was formal and to the point. "Dear Mr. Thompson, we are writing on behalf of a client who has expressed significant interest in acquiring your restaurant chain. Our client, a prominent investor with a substantial portfolio in the hospitality industry, is prepared to make an offer that we believe you will find more than satisfactory. Due to the sensitive nature of this transaction, our client has requested a private meeting to discuss the terms and conditions of the acquisition. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange a time that suits your schedule." In the world of business, the lines between ally and adversary can blur in the most unexpected ways. We look forward to your prompt response. Sincerely, Andrew H. Mitchell, ESQ, Mitchell, Stevens & Co. Harold read the letter twice, a slow smile spreading across his face. The prospect of selling his restaurant chain for a handsome profit was certainly appealing. Though he had no immediate plans to retire, the idea of cashing out at a peak moment was something he had considered in the past. The letter's tone and the law firm's reputation suggested that this offer was serious, perhaps even extraordinary. However, one detail piqued his curiosity. The identity of the investor was not revealed. Harold assumed it was a tactic to keep negotiations discreet, but part of him was eager to know who was behind the offer. Was it a competitor looking to expand, or perhaps a wealthy entrepreneur seeking to break into the fine dining market? The possibilities intrigued him. Deciding that this was an opportunity worth exploring, Harold immediately contacted the law firm and arranged a meeting for the following day. He felt a surge of anticipation as he hung up the phone. If the offer was as lucrative as the letter suggested, this could be the deal of a lifetime. The next day, Harold arrived at the law firm's office, a sleek building in the heart of the city's financial district. The lobby was all glass and polished stone, a testament to the firm's success and the wealth of its clientele. Harold was greeted by a well-dressed receptionist who escorted him to a conference room on the top floor. The room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. A large, polished table dominated the center of the room, flanked by comfortable leather chairs. Harold was early, as usual, and took a moment to appreciate the luxury of his surroundings. He had always prided himself on being a man of taste, someone who understood the finer things in life. This setting, with its understated elegance, appealed to him. It was the kind of place where deals worth millions were made, where power and influence were quietly wielded. As he waited, Harold allowed himself to imagine what life might be like after the sale. He could travel more, perhaps buy a villa in the south of France or a penthouse in New York. He could invest in other ventures, expand his portfolio, or even start a new business if he wished. The possibilities were endless, and the prospect of such freedom was intoxicating. The door to the conference room opened, and Harold turned, expecting to see a senior partner from the law firm, or perhaps the mysterious investor himself. Instead, he was met with a sight that stopped him cold. Standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed in tailored business attire, were David and Emma Smith. For a moment, Harold's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He had expected a wealthy investor, someone from his world, someone who fit his idea of what a high-powered dealmaker looked like. The last people he expected to see were the same couple he had thrown out of his restaurant just a few days ago. Yet there they were, calm, composed, and exuding an air of quiet confidence. "Mr. Thompson," David said, his voice smooth and professional, "thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Harold blinked, his usual composure slipping for just a moment. "Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, I wasn't expecting." He trailed off, unable to find the words. Emma stepped forward, her expression polite but firm. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Thompson. We have much to discuss." Still reeling from the shock, Harold found himself moving mechanically, taking a seat at the table. In the world of business, the lines between opportunity and threat can blur in an instant, revealing the true nature of those involved. "Marcus," David repeated, his voice steady. "And what type would that be, Mr. Thompson?" Harold hesitated for just a moment, sensing the trap that had been laid for him. But he was too far gone now, too committed to backing down. He had to regain control of the situation, no matter the cost. "We cater to a very specific demographic here," that Harold said, choosing his words carefully. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of exclusivity. I'm not sure you quite understand the nature of our establishment." There it was, the thinly veiled insult Harold had been building up to all evening. He had finally articulated what he had been thinking since the moment David and Emma walked through the door. They didn't belong here, not in his eyes, and he wanted them to know it. For a moment, silence enveloped the table. David and Emma exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, without breaking eye contact with Harold, David spoke. "I see," David said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Thompson." There was something in David's tone that made Harold uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had expected anger, perhaps even outrage, but instead he was met with calm acceptance. It was as if David had anticipated this confrontation and was simply waiting for it to unfold. Emma leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice firm yet polite. "But I assure you, we are fully aware of the nature of your establishment. That's precisely why we chose to dine here. We were looking forward to a special evening together." A flicker of doubt crossed Harold's mind. There was something about their quiet confidence that unsettled him, but he quickly brushed aside the doubt. He was the owner, and he had the final say on who was welcome in his restaurant. "I'm afraid I must insist," Harold said, his voice growing colder. "I don't believe this is the right place for you. I think it would be best if you left." The words slipped out before Harold could stop himself. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. But there was no turning back now. He had made his stance clear, and he was determined to see it through. David and Emma sat in silence for a moment, letting Harold's words sink in. Then, slowly, David stood up, with Emma following suit, her expression calm but resolute. They both understood that they could escalate the situation further, but they also knew it wasn't worth it. This was not the time or place for a confrontation. They had been disrespected, even humiliated, but they refused to let Harold see them as anything less than dignified. As they gathered their belongings, Harold felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it regret? Doubt? He wasn't sure. But he quickly buried the feeling, reminding himself that he had done what needed to be done. He had protected the image of his restaurant and ensured it remained a place for the right kind of people. Just as they were about to leave, David turned back to face Harold. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Harold suddenly feel very small. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson," David said, his voice steady. "We won't trouble you any further, but remember this, people will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Emma nodded in agreement, her gaze steady. "Have a good evening," she added, her voice polite but firm. With that, David and Emma turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Harold standing there, his hands clenched at his sides. The other diners who had been watching the confrontation with varying degrees of interest quickly returned to their meals, pretending not to have noticed what had just transpired. But the tension in the room lingered, a heavy unease that hung in the air long after David and Emma had gone. Harold returned to his post, his expression carefully composed. But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that there would be consequences for what he had done, that this would come back to haunt him. But Harold ignored the voice, pushing it down along with the uncomfortable feelings that accompanied it. He had won. He had asserted his authority and protected the integrity of his establishment. In the aftermath of choices made, the harsh reality of consequences often reveals the true cost of pride. Your investors, your clients, the media, they'll all hear about how you treated us. And trust me, Mr. Thompson, in today's world, that kind of story spreads fast. Harold's stomach churned. He knew she was right. A scandal like that could ruin him, destroy everything he had built, his reputation, his business, his future. It would all be in jeopardy. The realization was bitter, but there was no escaping it. He was trapped, cornered by his own actions. The same couple he had dismissed as insignificant now had the power to take everything from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. For a long moment, Harold sat in silence, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could try to negotiate, but he knew it would be futile. Marcus and Olivia had come prepared, and they weren't going to back down. They were offering him a way out, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he knew he had no choice but to take it. Finally, with great reluctance, Harold nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I'll agree to your terms." A small, satisfied smile played on Marcus's lips. "Excellent. Our lawyers will finalize the paperwork, and we can move forward with the sale." Olivia nodded in agreement, her expression softening slightly. "You're making the right decision, Mr. Thompson. This will be good for everyone involved." Harold didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, afraid that his anger and bitterness might spill over. Instead, he simply nodded again, signaling his acquiescence. The meeting continued with the lawyers going over the details of the contract, outlining the process for the sale. Harold listened in a daze, his mind still reeling from the shock of the situation. It felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. But it was real, too real, and there was no escaping it. By the time the meeting ended, the deal was all but sealed. The final papers would be signed within the week, and then it would be over. Harold would walk away with a substantial sum of money, but at the cost of everything he had worked for, everything that had defined him. As Marcus and Olivia stood to leave, Marcus extended his hand to Harold. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thompson. We'll ensure the transition is smooth." Harold shook his hand, the gesture stiff and formal. "I'm sure you will," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Olivia gave him a polite nod. "Goodbye, Mr. Thompson. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." With that, they left the room, their legal team following closely behind. Harold remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, resentment, regret. All of it churned within him, but there was also something else, something darker. Fear. For the first time in his life, Harold Thompson felt truly powerless. He had always prided himself on being in control, on shaping his own destiny. But now he realized that his actions, his choices, had led him to this moment. He had no one to blame but himself. As he sat there in the empty conference room, Harold understood that his life would never be the same. He had lost more than just his business. He had lost his pride, his dignity, his very sense of self. And there was no way to undo the damage, no way to turn back time. The twist of fate that had brought Marcus and Olivia into his life had upended everything he knew, leaving him adrift in a world that suddenly felt alien and hostile. All he could do now was accept the consequences and try to find a way forward, though he had no idea what that path might look like. For the first time in his life, Harold Thompson felt the weight of his own insignificance. He had always believed that wealth and power made him untouchable, that he was above the people he looked down on. But now he understood the truth. In the end, it wasn't money or status that defined a person, but the choices they made, the way they treated others. And Harold knew that his choices had led him to this moment, a moment of defeat, of surrender, of bitter realization. As he left the law firm and stepped out into the bustling city streets, Harold felt the cold wind bite at his skin. He pulled his coat tighter around him, but it did little to stave off the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The city moved around him, indifferent to his plight, as he made his way back to the restaurant that, for a little while longer, was still his. But as he walked, Harold knew that the world he had once commanded was slipping away. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The crisp autumn air seemed colder than usual as Harold Thompson walked back to La Maison Elegante after the meeting. His mind was in turmoil, churning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. He had always prided himself on being decisive, a man who knew what he wanted and how to get it. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt truly lost. The offer from Marcus and Olivia Daniels was everything he had ever dreamed of. Financially, at least. They were offering him a price well above market value, a sum that would secure his retirement and allow him to live out the rest of his days in luxury. On paper, it was a deal no sane person would refuse. But it wasn't that simple for Harold. As he entered the restaurant, he was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds, the soft lighting, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations. Normally, these things would have filled him with pride, a sense of accomplishment for what he had built. But today, they only reminded him of what he stood to lose. Harold retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He sank into his leather chair, staring at the framed photos on the wall, the certificates of achievement, the articles praising his restaurant's success. These were the symbols of his life's work, the legacy he had created through years of hard work and dedication. And now, it was all slipping away, threatened by a deal he felt cornered into accepting. In the quiet moments of reflection, the weight of one's choices can become an unbearable burden. His thoughts kept circling back to Marcus and Olivia. The memory of that night gnawed at him. The night he had dismissed them, insulted them, and ultimately thrown them out of his restaurant haunted him. At the time, he had felt justified, even righteous in his actions. But now, those actions had come back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. The thought of losing his restaurant to the very people he had disrespected was almost unbearable. It wasn't just about the money, it was about his pride, his identity. For years, Harold had crafted an image for himself, a man of wealth, power, and influence. Someone who commanded respect and admiration. Selling his restaurant to a black couple, no matter how wealthy or successful they were, felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. But the financial incentive was undeniable. The offer was generous, more than generous, really. It was enough to ensure that he and his family would never want for anything again. Yet, as he weighed the decision, Harold found himself trapped between two powerful forces, his pride and his greed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how deeply his pride was wounded. He had always seen himself as above the people he served, above those who worked for him, and certainly above the people he considered outsiders. The idea of those outsiders taking control of what he had built, profiting from his hard work, was intolerable. And yet, what choice did he have? Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to make sense of it all. The pressure from his investors and partners was mounting. They had been enthusiastic about the offer when he hinted at it, seeing it as a golden opportunity to cash out. They were unaware of the racial undercurrents that complicated the situation for Harold. To them, this was just another business deal, a chance to walk away with a substantial profit. If they knew the truth, if they understood how deeply his racism ran, Harold knew they would be shocked. They had always seen him as a savvy businessman, someone who made decisions based on logic and profit, not prejudice. But Harold had spent his life carefully curating his image, hiding his true feelings behind a veneer of professionalism. He had never let anyone see the contempt he held for those who didn't fit his idea of who belonged in his world. But now his bigotry was costing him everything. The very attitudes he had clung to so tightly were now the source of his greatest struggle. Harold could see the irony in it, even if he wasn't ready to laugh at it yet. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from one of his investors, a man named Richard Foster. Richard had been with him from the beginning, one of the first to believe in his vision for La Maison Elegante. The message was brief, but the meaning was clear. We need to talk. Don't let this opportunity slip through our fingers. Harold knew what Richard wanted to discuss. The investors were growing impatient. They saw the deal as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to cash in on their investment, and they couldn't understand why Harold was hesitating. They trusted him to negotiate in their best interests, to secure a deal that would benefit them all. But Harold knew that if they understood his true reservations, they might start to question his judgment. Still, he couldn't bring himself to tell them the whole truth. Instead, he had been vague in his responses, citing the need for careful negotiation, the importance of getting the terms just right. But as the days passed, it was becoming harder to justify the delay. The pressure was building, and Harold could feel the walls closing in around him. That night, Harold sat alone in his office, long after the restaurant had closed. The staff had gone home, the lights were dimmed, and the silence was almost oppressive. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window at the city lights below. The drink burned as it went down, but it did little to numb the turmoil inside him. He knew he needed to make a decision soon. The longer he waited, the more difficult it would become. But the decision wasn't just about money or pride. It was about who he was and who he wanted to be. Harold had always seen himself as a man of principle, someone who stood by his beliefs no matter the cost. But now, those beliefs were being tested in ways he had never anticipated. As he sat there, Harold began to reflect on his past actions. He thought about the countless times he had judged others, dismissed them, or treated them unfairly simply because they didn't fit his narrow view of the world. He had always justified it to himself, telling himself that he was protecting his business, maintaining his image. But now, for the first time, he began to question whether those justifications had been worth it. Had his pride been worth the cost? The question lingered in his mind, refusing to go away. Harold had always believed that his success was a reflection of his superiority, that his wealth and status proved he was better than those he looked down on. But now, As he faced the possibility of losing everything, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. The thought unsettled him. It was easier to cling to his old beliefs, to tell himself that he was right and everyone else was wrong. But deep down, Harold knew that something had changed. The events of the past week had forced him to confront truths about himself that he had long ignored, and it was a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. The next day, Harold met with his investors. They gathered in the private dining room of the restaurant, a space normally reserved for exclusive clientele. The mood was tense as they discussed the offer, each investor weighing in on the potential benefits. Richard Foster, as usual, was the most vocal. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," Richard said, his voice filled with excitement. "We've spent years building this brand, and now we have a chance to sell at the peak. We'd be fools not to take it." The other investors nodded in agreement, their expressions eager. They saw dollar signs, a chance to cash out and move on to their next ventures. They trusted Harold to lead them, to make the right decision, but they were growing impatient. They wanted answers. When pride blinds us to our truths, the consequences can be staggering. Harold listened to the arguments around the table, nodding along as his investors spoke. He understood their position. From a financial perspective, it made perfect sense to accept the offer. Yet as the discussion unfolded, a growing sense of unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at stake, something that transcended mere money. Finally, Richard turned to Harold, his expression expectant. "So what's the holdup, Harold? You've been quiet. Are you planning to take the deal or not?" Harold hesitated, searching for the right words. He knew he couldn't stall much longer. The investors were looking to him for a decision. But as he surveyed the room, it became clear that none of them truly grasped what he was grappling with. They perceived this as just another business deal, while for Harold, it was profoundly personal. He cleared his throat, striving to steady his voice. "I understand your concerns, Richard, and believe me, I see the value in this offer. But there are complexities we need to consider." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Complexities? What kind of complexities?" Harold hesitated again. He couldn't disclose the truth without revealing the prejudices that had shaped so many of his decisions. Instead, he attempted to frame it in business terms. "The buyers have certain conditions. They want complete control and insist that I step away entirely." "That's normal in a deal like this," interjected one of the other investors. "It's standard for new owners to want a clean slate." "Yes, but it's more than that," Harold replied, choosing his words with care. "They want me out, completely out. No involvement, no public statements. They expect me to disappear." Richard frowned. "And what's the issue with that? You've been running this place for years, Harold. Maybe it's time to step back and enjoy life." Harold felt a flicker of irritation. It was easy for them to say. They hadn't built this business from the ground up. They hadn't poured their heart and soul into it. Yet, as much as he wanted to resist, he knew they had a point. He had spent years working tirelessly, sacrificing his personal life for the sake of the restaurant. Perhaps it was indeed time to let go. But letting go meant conceding defeat, and that was something Harold couldn't stomach. The investors continued to press him, urging him to accept the deal. They pointed out the financial benefits, the security it would provide, the freedom it would grant him. But for Harold, the decision wasn't solely about money. It was about pride and the legacy he would leave behind. As the meeting progressed, Harold felt the weight of their expectations bearing down on him. They trusted him to make the right decision, to protect their investments, and to secure their future. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't comprehend what it would cost him personally to follow through with the deal. After the meeting, Harold retreated to his office, more conflicted than ever. He realized he needed to make a decision soon, but every time he tried to think it through, doubt clouded his mind. The financial incentive was too tempting to ignore, but the thought of relinquishing his restaurant, his pride and joy, to Marcus and Olivia Daniels was almost unbearable. In the days that followed, Harold existed in a state of constant agitation, replaying the details in his mind, searching for a way out. But no matter how he viewed it, He couldn't escape the fact that his bigotry had led him to this juncture. If he had treated Marcus and Olivia with the respect they deserved that night, none of this would be happening. But he hadn't, and now he was paying the price. The internal conflict gnawed at him, robbing him of sleep and distracting him during the day. He couldn't focus on anything else. The decision loomed over him like a dark cloud. He knew he couldn't delay much longer. The investors were growing restless, and the pressure was mounting. Yet, each time he contemplated signing the deal, a knot of resentment tightened in his chest. Why should he have to surrender everything he had worked for due to one mistake? Why should he allow Marcus and Olivia to triumph when they had no rightful claim to his world? But deep down, Harold knew that this mindset was fundamentally flawed. He recognized that his pride, his prejudice, had clouded his judgment for too long. He had always seen himself as superior, as someone who deserved success more than anyone else. But now, as he faced the reality of losing everything, he came to the painful realization that his arrogance had been his undoing. The struggle within him intensified, pulling him in conflicting directions. On one hand, he wanted to cling to his pride, to refuse the deal and keep his restaurant, regardless of the consequences. On the other hand, he understood that this was a futile battle. The offer was too enticing, the pressure too overwhelming, and if he refused, he risked losing everything anyway: his reputation, his business, his future. Days blurred into one another, each one bringing him closer to the inevitable decision. Harold felt as though he were standing on the precipice of a cliff, uncertain whether to leap or cling to the edge for dear life. He knew he couldn't remain suspended indefinitely, but the thought of taking the plunge filled him with dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harold made his decision. He would accept the deal. He would sell the restaurant, walk away with the money, and attempt to rebuild his life. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he recognized it was the only option left to him. His pride had cost him enough. He couldn't allow it to take everything. The following week, Harold met with his lawyers and the Daniels legal team to finalize the paperwork. In the face of one's own choices, the true cost of pride often reveals itself in unexpected ways. The process unfolded efficiently, almost mechanically, as the details were meticulously hammered out and the documents prepared for signing. Harold sat in silence, his attention drifting as the lawyers discussed the finer points of the deal, barely absorbing the terms being outlined. When it came time to sign the papers, Harold hesitated for a moment. His pen hovered above the page, his hand trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the finality of it all. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and he had to live with it. Taking a deep breath, Harold signed his name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving behind a stark black mark that sealed his fate. It was done. The deal was finalized swiftly thereafter. The Daniels legal team moved with precision, ensuring that every detail was in order. Harold felt a strange detachment as he observed them work, as if he were witnessing the conclusion of someone else's life, not his own. But this was indeed his life, and now it was changing forever. Once the papers were signed, Marcus and Olivia expressed their gratitude with polite smiles, their expressions inscrutable. There was no gloating, no hint of triumph, just a quiet satisfaction, as if they had achieved what they set out to do and were ready to move forward. Harold couldn't help but admire their composure, even if it stung to see them take control of what had once been his. As the meeting concluded, Marcus extended his hand to Harold once more. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. We'll take good care of the restaurant." Harold shook his hand, his grip firm, though his heart felt heavy. "I'm sure you will," he replied, forcing a smile. Olivia nodded in agreement. "We look forward to continuing the legacy you've built." Harold didn't trust himself to respond, so he simply nodded in return. He recognized their good intentions, but their words felt hollow. The legacy they spoke of was no longer his. It belonged to them now. As he exited the meeting, Harold was engulfed by a profound sense of loss. He had made the right decision, the logical decision, but it didn't feel right. It felt like defeat, like surrendering to forces beyond his control. And in a way, it was. He had been compelled to confront the consequences of his actions and face the reality of his own shortcomings. It was a harsh lesson, one he wasn't sure he would ever fully accept. In the days that followed, Harold grappled with his new reality. He told himself that the financial windfall was worth it, that he had made a wise business move. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the bitterness lingered. He had lost something that couldn't be quantified in monetary terms: his pride, his identity, his very sense of self. For years, Harold had defined himself his success by the power and influence he wielded. But now he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. That power had been built on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice, and it had crumbled beneath him. He had spent a lifetime looking down on others, believing himself to be superior, smarter, and more deserving. Yet in the end, it was his own pride that had brought him to his knees. As he sat alone in his empty office, the restaurant no longer his, Harold realized that he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. The true struggle wasn't with Marcus and Olivia, or the investors, or even the deal itself. It was with himself, with the man he had become, and the beliefs he had clung to so tightly. Now, as he faced an uncertain future, Harold understood that the hardest part was yet to come. He needed to confront the truth about who he was and who he aspired to be. That, more than anything, was the struggle he had been evading all his life. The day Harold Thompson reluctantly signed over his beloved restaurant, La Maison Elegante, to Marcus and Olivia Daniels, was one he would never forget. The crisp official signatures on the legal documents marked the end of an era for Harold and the dawn of a new chapter for the Daniels. What had once been his pride and joy, the crown jewel of his career, was now theirs. The deal was done, and there was no turning back. Harold tried to maintain his composure as he handed over the final set of keys, his fingers lingering for a moment before relinquishing them. Marcus and Olivia accepted the keys with the same calm professionalism they had displayed throughout the negotiations. They expressed their gratitude once more, offering the same courteous smiles they had shown him when they first entered the restaurant. But this time, Harold perceived those smiles in a different light. They weren't merely polite. They were triumphant. As Harold walked out of the office for the last time, he couldn't shake the weight of finality that pressed down upon him. The restaurant, once a symbol of his success and stature, was no longer his. The realization settled over him like a heavy fog, obscuring any sense of satisfaction he might have felt from the money earned in the sale. He had signed away more than just a business. He had surrendered a piece of himself. In the days that followed, the sale of La Maison Elegante became the talk of the town. The local community, long accustomed to the restaurant's reputation for exclusivity and prestige, was taken aback by the sudden change in ownership. News of the sale spread quickly, fueled by the gossip that thrived in the upscale circles Harold had once frequented. But it wasn't just the sale itself that sparked discussion. It was the narrative behind it. The story of how Harold Thompson, a wealthy and proud restaurant owner, had subtly disrespected a black couple dining at his establishment, only to sell the entire business to that same co. People whispered about the turn of events in hushed tones, both horrified and fascinated. The story took on a life of its own, evolving into a cautionary tale about pride, prejudice, and poetic justice. As it circulated through the community, the narrative grew increasingly dramatic with each retelling. Some individuals added embellishments, recounting the incident with a sense of schadenfreude, relishing the downfall of a man who had always viewed himself as superior to others. Others expressed genuine outrage, appalled that someone as prominent as Harold could harbor such outdated and offensive views. The public announcement of the sale only stoked the flames of discontent. A local newspaper boldly ran a headline that encapsulated the essence of the story. Restaurateur sells business to couple he once spurned. The article meticulously detailed the events leading to the sale, recounting how Marcus and Olivia Daniels, successful entrepreneurs in their own right, had turned the tables on Harold. It painted a vivid picture of comeuppance, a man brought low by his own arrogance and bigotry. For Harold, the backlash was swift and unforgiving. His former clients, many of whom had once admired him for his accomplishments, began to distance themselves. They had tolerated his eccentricities and his insistence on maintaining a certain image for his restaurant. However, now that the truth about his behavior was exposed, they viewed him in an entirely different light. The racism that had always lurked beneath the surface was now glaringly evident, and it was something they could no longer ignore. The elite clientele that had once flocked to La Maison Elegante began to shun Harold, treating him like a pariah. Invitations to social events evaporated, and old friends suddenly became too busy to return his calls. The people who had once praised his refined taste and business acumen now whispered behind his back, questioning how they could have ever associated with someone like him. Even those who shared some of his views kept their distance, wary of the stain on their own reputations. Harold's downfall was not merely social, it was financial as well. While the sale of the restaurant had provided him with a substantial sum, it was insufficient to sustain the lavish lifestyle to which he had grown accustomed. His other business ventures began to falter as word of his behavior spread. Investors pulled out, reluctant to be linked to a man whose reputation was now tainted. Opportunities that had once been abundant began to dwindle, leaving Harold with fewer and fewer options. The public reaction extended beyond whispers and cold shoulders. Harold began receiving letters and emails from individuals expressing their disappointment and disgust. Some were polite yet firm, others were openly hostile. Former employees, who had once endured Harold's demanding demeanor, spoke out about the subtle racism they had experienced during their time at the restaurant. They recount stories of being overlooked for promotions, of being treated differently than their white colleagues, and of enduring Harold's condescending remarks. These revelations only further tarnished Harold's reputation. The narrative of his downfall became increasingly damning as tales of his discriminatory behavior piled up. It wasn't just the one incident with Marcus and Olivia, there was now a clear pattern, a history of racism that could no longer be denied. The community that had once celebrated Harold as a successful businessman now saw him for who he truly was, a man whose wealth and status had masked a deep-seated prejudice. Harold's attempts to salvage his reputation proved futile. He tried to downplay the incident, insisting that it had been blown out of proportion and that he had merely been upholding the high standards of his restaurant. But no one was convinced. The damage was done, and there was no way to reverse it. His words rang hollow, stripped of the power they once held. The community had made its decision, and Harold was left to confront the consequences. As the months passed, Harold found himself increasingly isolated. The social circles he had once inhabited became closed off to him, and the respect he had commanded vanished. He spent his days in solitude, nursing his regrets and replaying the events that had led to his downfall. He could not escape the bitter truth. It was his own actions, his own pride that had brought him to this point. The regret gnawed at him, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Harold had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who lived by his own rules. But now he was compelled to confront the reality that those principles had been rooted in prejudice, in a belief in his own superiority, and that belief had cost him everything: his business, his reputation, his place in the world. The public fallout from the sale also had a profound impact on La Maison Elegante itself. Under the stewardship of Marcus and Olivia Daniels, the restaurant underwent a significant transformation. They maintained the high standards and elegance that had made the restaurant famous, yet they infused it with a new sense of inclusivity and warmth that had been absent during Harold's tenure. The clientele became more diverse, reflecting the evolving face of the city, and the restaurant thrived in ways it had never done before. For the community, the success of La Maison Elegante under new ownership was a fitting conclusion to the narrative. It served as proof that change was not only possible, but necessary, that the old ways of thinking could be challenged and ultimately overcome. The restaurant, once a symbol of exclusion and elitism, became a welcoming space for everyone. And for many, this was the ultimate irony. The very thing Harold had fought to preserve was now flourishing without him and in many ways in spite of him. As the restaurant continued to prosper, Harold's life devolved into a shadow of its former self. He retreated further into isolation, avoiding the places and people that reminded him of his past. The wealth he had accrued from the sale did little to soothe his discontent. It felt like a hollow victory, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He now occupied a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the upscale neighborhood where he had once resided. In his solitude, Harold found ample time for reflection, contemplating the choices he had made and the beliefs he had held. He pondered the people he had wronged, the opportunities he had squandered, and the pride that had ultimately led to his undoing. The bitterness and resentment that once fueled him were now replaced by a profound, gnawing regret. When pride blinds us to our shortcomings, the consequences can be far-reaching and irreversible. But it was too late for regrets. The world had moved on, and Harold was left behind, a relic of a bygone era. The community that had once admired him now viewed him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when pride and prejudice go unchecked. For Harold, there was no redemption, no way to undo the damage he had inflicted. In the end, Harold found himself left with nothing but his pride and his regrets. The restaurant he had once poured his heart and soul into was no longer his, and the legacy he had hoped to create was forever tarnished. He had lost everything that mattered, not due to bad luck or circumstance, but because of his own actions. The consequences of his decisions had unfolded before him, leaving him with a life that felt empty and meaningless. Harold Thompson, once a man of wealth and influence, now found himself alone, shunned by the community he had once dominated. The fall from grace was complete, and there was no way back. All that remained was the memory of what could have been and the painful realization that his own pride had led to his downfall. As Harold sat in his empty apartment, surrounded by the trappings of a life that no longer held any meaning, he recognized that he had learned the lesson too late. The world had changed, but he hadn't adapted to it. Now, he was paying the price. Under the stewardship of Marcus and Olivia Daniels, La Maison Elegante underwent a remarkable transformation. They rebranded the restaurant, shedding its former image of exclusivity and elitism. The new La Maison Elegante was a welcoming space for everyone, regardless of race, class, or background. Marcus and Olivia understood that true elegance lay not in exclusion, but in fostering an atmosphere of warmth, inclusivity, and respect for all who entered. The changes they implemented were subtle, yet powerful. The decor was refreshed to reflect a more modern and diverse aesthetic, blending the restaurant's classic charm with contemporary touches that made it feel both luxurious and inviting. The menu also evolved, offering a wider variety of dishes that celebrated different cultures and flavors. They took great care to ensure that every aspect of the dining experience made people feel valued and appreciated. Word of the transformation spread quickly, and soon the restaurant attracted a broader clientele than ever before. Individuals from all walks of life came to experience the new La Maison Elegante, drawn by its reputation for excellence and its commitment to inclusivity. The restaurant became a symbol of positive change within the community, a place where the old barriers of race and class were dismantled in favor of a more open and welcoming environment. Business flourished under Marcus and Olivia's leadership. The restaurant's revenues soared, consistently receiving glowing reviews from both critics and patrons alike. It became a favored destination for anniversaries, celebrations, and business meetings, with reservations often booked weeks in advance. Marcus and Olivia succeeded not only in preserving the restaurant's legacy, but in elevating it to new heights. While they thrived, Harold Thompson watched from the sidelines. Now living in obscurity, he had become a mere spectator in the world he once dominated. He followed the success of La Maison Elegante from afar, reading rave reviews in the newspapers and hearing about it from people in the community. Each article and every mention of the restaurant's newfound glory served as a bitter reminder of what he had lost. Harold spent his days in quiet reflection, replaying the events that had led to his downfall over and over in his mind. He contemplated the decisions he had made, the pride he had clung to, and the deep-seated prejudices that had ultimately cost him everything. The realization was painful. His racism had not only stripped him of his business, but had also deprived him of an opportunity to grow and evolve as a person. In his younger years, Harold had taken pride in the standards he maintained at La Maison Elegante. He had convinced himself that these standards were about preserving the restaurant's image, about keeping it exclusive and refined. Yet now, as he reflected on his past actions, he saw them for what they truly were, an excuse to exclude those he deemed unworthy, a means to uphold a false sense of superiority. Such attitudes had no place in a changing world. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. Marcus and Olivia, the very individuals he had dismissed as unfit for his restaurant's image, had proven to be far more capable and visionary than he had ever been. They had taken what he had built and improved upon it, transforming it into something that resonated with the values of a more inclusive and diverse society. In doing so, they had revealed to him the true meaning of elegance and success, concepts he had never fully grasped. As the years passed, Harold's bitterness gradually gave way to regret. He came to understand that the world had moved on without him, embracing ideals of inclusivity and acceptance that he had resisted for so long. The pride that had once defined him now felt hollow, and the wealth he had accumulated brought him little solace. He was alone, isolated from the community he had once inhabited, with nothing to show for his years of hard work, but memories of what could have been. In a moment of weakness, Harold decided to return to La Maison Elegante. Perhaps, he thought, he could find some solace in revisiting the place that had once been his pride and joy. He rationalized that enough time had passed and that it wouldn't hurt to see how things had changed. After all, he had been instrumental in the restaurant's initial success, hadn't he? Maybe, just maybe, he could feel some connection to it again. Harold picked up the phone and called the restaurant to make a reservation. The voice on the other end was polite and professional, as expected. He gave his name, Harold Thompson, and requested a table for one on the upcoming weekend. Sometimes the weight of our choices can haunt us long after the moment has passed. There was a brief pause, followed by a response that made Harold's heart sink. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," the hostess said, her tone courteous yet firm, "but we don't have a reservation under your name." For a moment, Harold was left speechless. He had fully anticipated being accommodated, recognized as the former owner of the restaurant, even after selling it. Yet the hostess offered no indication that she knew who he was. There was no effort to make an exception. To her, he was merely another customer, one of the many who had called to secure a table. Harold cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "Could you check again? I used to own the restaurant, you see, and—" "I understand, sir," the hostess interjected gently. "But our reservation system is quite full. Perhaps you could try another date." Harold thanked her and hung up the phone with a heavy sigh. The irony was striking. The restaurant he had once controlled, the very place where he had turned away Marcus and Olivia, now had no room for him. He was just another name on a waiting list, indistinguishable from the countless others seeking to dine at the newly revamped La Maison Elegante. As he sat in his modest apartment, the reality of his situation began to settle in. The restaurant had moved on, and so had the world. There was no turning back, no reclaiming what he had lost. Marcus and Olivia had not only taken over his business, they had accomplished what he had never been able to achieve. They had transformed it into a space that embraced everyone, a testament to the principles of inclusivity and respect. For Harold, the truth was inescapable. His downfall had been of his own making. His racism had cost him not just his business and reputation, but his place in the world. And now, the restaurant that had once been his pride and joy was thriving without him. A symbol of everything he had failed to comprehend. The final irony was bitter, yet also deserved. Harold had fought to preserve an image of exclusivity and superiority, only to see it dismantled by the very people he had dismissed. Ultimately, it was Marcus and Olivia who had the last word, turning La Maison Elegante into something far greater than Harold had ever envisioned. And Harold was left with nothing but his regrets, a solitary figure in a world that had moved on without him. Do you believe Marcus and Olivia's decision to purchase the restaurant was the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this narrative, please consider subscribing to my channel. I dedicate a lot of time and effort to crafting these heartfelt stories, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Hello, amazing friends. We'd love to get to know you better. Drop your name and where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Each one of you plays a crucial role in our community, and we can't express how much we value your support. Your presence not only motivates us, but it also helps spread our message and shine a light on important issues. Together, we're opening eyes to injustice and striving for a better, fairer world. You inspire us every day, and we couldn't do this without you. Enjoy the video, and let's keep making a difference.